colleagues from industry, from investment, from civil society who are supporting the work of the platform. It's a delight to welcome you to this event on the EU taxonomy, the work of the platform, and of course, transition finance. I'm delighted to introduce our colleague and host from the Commission this morning, Martin Spolch. Martin is the head of unit, Sustainable Finance, European Commission. Martin will open our session this morning, and then we will get into all of the details for you. So Martin, over to you.
Thank you, Nathan. Good morning to you all. I'm very delighted to welcome you at this very important event on taxonomy on behalf of the whole Commission's team. The purpose of this event, structured into 5 dedicated sessions, is to provide an opportunity to inform you all in an open and transparent manner about the progress achieved in the various work streams of the platform on sustainable finance. And of course, in the first place, to provide you all with an opportunity to discuss a variety of key concepts being developed with the platform members directly. We also hope that the event will also improve a general understanding and increase awareness of the taxonomy concept, which is badly needed. Just to recall, the European Commission established the platform on sustainable finance last September. The main purpose of the platform, as prescribed by the taxonomy regulation, is to advise the European Commission on several tasks and topics related to further development of EU taxonomy. Specifically, we mandated the platform to advise the Commission on the technical screening criteria, in particular for the other 4 environmental objectives, and including on the usability of those criteria, not only for the financial sector, but for the businesses as well. The second type of advice is on the review of the taxonomy regulation itself and on covering other sustainability objectives, including social objectives and activities that significantly harm the environment. And of course, to advise the Commission on sustainable finance policy more broadly, we wanted to give the platform the opportunity to advise the Commission on other areas than taxonomy that will be very useful for our deliberations on the renewed sustainable finance strategy. Now, I have to say that we were very pleased to see such a huge interest in the work of the platform and to see so many outstanding applications for the platform that we received last summer. And I am really very delighted to be able to put together such an outstanding group of the best experts in the field that is now advising the Commission in the right direction. At the same time, I must confess that it was a very frustrating exercise to select the members, because at the same time we also had to disappoint many of you who had not only excellent credentials and expertise, but also wanted to contribute to the work. Yet we have not been able to accommodate your application given the limited capacity of the platform. But we didn't want to miss that input and contribution, and therefore already last autumn, in agreement with the platform members, we committed to a series of outreach events that would provide the possibility to all interested stakeholders not only to get updated, but to contribute in the first place. And that's exactly why we are here today. Now, before I dive into the topic of this very first session dedicated to enabling transition finance, let me say a few words about the taxonomy project and where exactly we stand with the project currently. As you know, taxonomy is a central piece of our policy, which we hope will have a transformational impact not only of the financial sector, but also of the businesses and our economy at large. Taxonomy is a robust tool that translates the long-term ambitious targets into what needs to be done on the ground. It defines how good is good enough. What is in line with our 2050 climate neutrality and the European Green Deal targets. It is a benchmark that clearly sets out criteria for economic activities that can be deemed in line with those targets, that can be deemed sustainable. So in a way, it shows the way where to go. And as such, taxonomy is supposed to be a tool for facilitating transition towards these targets. Let me also recall that taxonomy is a tool that the financial sector was calling for itself. We followed the recommendation of the high-level expert group that we received back in 2018, and we put it as action number 1 in our action plan from March 2018. Now, as regards the approach, you all are very well aware that we have decided to legislate in order to introduce legal certainty and transparency. The taxonomy regulation imposes disclosure requirements, to what extent and how the taxonomy has been used, but it does not impose any behavioral requirements to invest into certain assets or companies or divest from others. There has been a lot of anxiety about this point. I would admit understandable anxiety, but let me clarify once again that taxonomy is not a mandatory list of activities that investors have to invest in. Taxonomy for us is supposed to be a dictionary that defines whether specific investments are considered to meet legal requirements to be considered sustainable. Also, what is not in the current taxonomy is not automatically bad. We are building the taxonomy over time, and more activities will be added logically. This is rather the beginning of the journey and not the end of the road. We often say that there are three conditions for the success, apart from the obvious condition that the project must be politically acceptable, but that's obvious. So the first condition is taxonomy must be credible, must be science-based. Second condition, it must be usable. It must be easy to use. It should be perceived in the first place by stakeholders as a useful tool rather than a regulatory burden. And finally, it must support transition. As regards the latter, the last condition, that it must support transition, in order to have an impact, it must cover all key economic sectors, in particular those that currently have the most significant negative environmental impact and where the potential to reduce this negative impact is the greatest. And we have been very encouraged to see the work of the technical expert group, which has pursued this avenue and allowed us to put together an excellent basis for our work. We also believe, therefore, that the taxonomy in its current design and its current stage and draft already represents a useful guide for many sectors to transition towards sustainability. We hope that taxonomy will allow businesses to set out clear plans and commit financing to meet the thresholds. Investments will be taxonomy aligned where they meet the thresholds or where they finance clear plans to get there. But we do need to articulate more clearly that taxonomy can be used not only for those companies that will be able to meet the thresholds already today or tomorrow, but also for companies that will need more time to meet all the criteria. So I'm sure that you are interested to hear from me now a little bit more about the Delegated Act, where we stand. I have to first of all thank you very much for the substantial contributions that we have received in the public consultation that we launched last November. We were literally overwhelmed with the responses. We received more than 46,000 responses. But I must say that the responses that we have received, we have carefully reviewed all of them, and I am confident that they are helping us to improve the draft further. There have been 4 types of criticisms that I would like to mention. The first one is that the taxonomy is either too tough or indeed not tough enough. The second one is that taxonomy goes beyond existing EU legislation and existing EU policies. The third one is that more work is needed on the taxonomy usability. And the last one is that taxonomy is too binary. So let me maybe take each of them one by one and focus in particular on the last one, that taxonomy is too binary. As regards the criticism that the taxonomy is too tough or too loose, not tough enough, obviously the Commission is considering recalibrating the technical screening criteria where serious concerns have been raised and where the justification for the alternative proposal has been robust. But in any case, we do not want to break the link with science or the alignment with the European Green Deal target. That would be a big mistake, and we will certainly not pursue that avenue. As regards the second type of criticism, that taxonomy goes beyond existing EU legislation, well, this is true. To quote Commissioner McGuinness, who spoke about this issue in the Econ Committee of the European Parliament a few weeks ago, Commissioner clarified that the taxonomy does go further in some cases than existing legislation and policy because it is necessary to do so. Because the EU is committed to climate neutrality by 2050, and the taxonomy is a science-based guide to achieving that target. The status quo is why we have a climate problem. That's what the Commissioner had to say. Now, as regards the concern about usability, we treat those concerns very seriously. And as you know, the subgroup of the platform on data and usability is helping the Commission to address those to the extent possible. And I'm very excited to hear the discussion later this afternoon. As regards the last concern, that taxonomy is too binary, many stakeholders have expressed concerns that taxonomy in its current design does not yet exploit the full potential. It has to support transition. Stakeholders argued that more work is needed to ensure that taxonomy supports transition not only towards green and sustainable, but also transition from negative impact to low impact, whatever greener, whatever better. And this is exactly, the purpose of the webinar today, to explore what more can be done. This type of feedback also triggered the request that the Commission put forward to the platform, where we articulated the need to exploit and articulate the full potential of the EU taxonomy to support transition investment flows. We explicitly said that further reflection is needed on how the taxonomy framework and the sustainable finance framework more broadly could enable inclusive transition finance for all companies investing to improve their environmental impact. We asked the platform 6 questions that I will not read in the interest of time to you, but these questions are really very fundamental in terms of understanding to what extent the existing framework can help addressing these concerns and to what extent we do need to go beyond the existing framework of taxonomy and also address those concerns by other tools that we have at disposal. So as such, the input of the platform that is now scheduled and due in by mid-March, will feed into the various work streams of the Sustainable Finance Policy Agenda. The first one is obvious, the Delegated Act that the Commission intends to adopt in the second half of April, but also into the renewed Sustainable Finance Strategy that the Commission intends to adopt later in the second quarter. I also am confident that the input of the platform will be very useful for the deliberations of the Commission on the finalization of the Delegated Act under Article 8 of the Taxonomy Regulation that will specify the disclosure requirements of both financial and non-financial undertakings covered by the Non-Financial Reporting Directive. There we have also received the advice of the ESAs, which will obviously be a big element of our work. Finally, let me also say a few words about the timeline, because we are aware that this request that we have given to the platform had an implication on the resources and on the focus of the platform. And therefore, in agreement with the chair, Nathan Fabian, and the rapporteurs and the members of the platform, the deliverables of the platform on the core mandate that was given to the platform back in September will be now September, October later this year. But I'm sure that Nathan will say a few more words about that. Now, in conclusion, I would like to thank all of you who will participate at the webinars today and on Friday for all your questions, for all your insights, comments, and proposals for improvements. We are very eager to hear that. I also would like to, and in particular would like to thank all members and observers of the platform, in particular the chair, Nathan Fabian, the rapporteurs, Marcia Traverso, Ben Allen, Nancy Sash, Antje Schneeweiss, and Helena Viñez Fiestas for their excellent leadership, for their excellent work. I'm aware that all members of the platform are working very hard on top of their full-time job that they have, but I'm very, very encouraged by the progress that we have seen. I also would like to thank the whole Commission's team, not only colleagues in DG FISMA, but all other colleagues in all other departments of the Commission, because this is a truly joint exercise. We cannot do this project in FISMA only. And finally, I also would like to thank colleagues who have made this event happen today, Tina Krajšek, Natalie Mansart, and Andreas Reichel in particular. So Nathan, I am passing back to you. I am very excited to hear all the discussions and all the insights. Have a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for your words about the work of the platform, because this is a group that is working very, very hard and trying to respond to all the stakeholder interest and concern. Now, I will just give some short remarks before we go into our discussion. You've been looking at this slide, why a taxonomy, for a long time now, and so I'm sure it's on your brains, your minds forever. I hope that's the case. That will have been very helpful. I'll give a quick overview, but I just want to say that this is not going to be an introductory session on the taxonomy today. If you're new to the taxonomy, there are some great resources you can have a look at. So if you just do an internet search for EU taxonomy for sustainable activities or EU platform on sustainable finance, you will find a lot of resources, including some videos that explain the work that we're doing here, and that would be a great place to start if you're a beginner. So excuse us if we move through some of this quite quickly. We're trying to deal with some of the more advanced concepts here, but hopefully we will also have now learned to communicate in a way that's very clear and helpful about the taxonomy. So, the question of what the taxonomy is very important. And it's important to think about this question when we're trying to make judgments about how to improve it in future. So we see the taxonomy as an inventory for the future. It provides a list of economic activities and clarity on what is environmentally sustainable. What we need to do to make a material difference to achieving a sustainable future. It is a reporting enabler. Can we just stay on the previous slide, please? Thank you. It is a reporting enabler. It enables measurement of the degree of environmental fitness of an investment product, remembering that there are going to be legal obligations for disclosures on financial products around environmental contribution. And this is a tool that will enable financial product providers and companies to report on the level of environmental contribution they're making. The third point, it's a transition tool. This taxonomy will help investors and companies to plan and report on their transition. Now, there's a very important message here. There's a difference between having a tool and what you use it for. And this is going to be a part of the discussion today. We believe that this tool can support transition, it can be inclusive, and we're going to set out how we think that can work. The fourth point there, set out in EU law. We now have a legal requirement on taxonomy regulation. It has clear requirements, clear expectations of financial product providers, and ultimately that will flow onto companies. And so there are legal obligations which will come into force, which we must fulfill, and these guide our decisions. We'll explain that further in a moment. The next point, we've built this taxonomy using evidence and science. There's clear rationale for the choices that have been made on prioritization of activities and the setting of criteria. Sometimes it takes a while to appreciate just how much analysis and work has gone on to develop these robust criteria. And we invite you to look further into that work and the rationale behind those criteria. And the last point, we know we need the criteria and the taxonomy to be dynamic. We know that we need to update them over time to support transition, and we need to be as comprehensive as possible across the economy so that many companies, many countries can see their role in climate transition through the taxonomy. So inclusive transition is our aim, but we must base the tool on evidence and a clear rationale based on the climate goals that we face. Now, it's important to say what the taxonomy is not. It is not a mandatory list to invest in or to finance. This is really very important. It is primarily a transparency tool that can be used by the market to help inform the flow of capital. Now, any investor or bank who only uses the taxonomy, who uses no other tools to support their decision-making around transition, will not be fulfilling their duty as financial market participants or their potential role in transition. I think that is clear, and we're going to again explore this issue today as well. To the next slide, please. Now, if we're talking about transition finance, we need to think for a moment about what we're talking about. What does transition mean? And who uses the term and why? So the term transition is used in all of these circumstances you can see, in the economy broadly, in financial portfolios, for companies, and of course for economic activities and the assets within those economic activities. Now, the economy, financial portfolio, and company idea, these are generally portfolio ideas. So a mix of assets and a mix of performance. And of course, when you're transitioning a portfolio, it's okay to have some high emissions activities and some low emissions activities, and to gradually change the performance of that portfolio over time, of the economy, of the company, of the financial product or portfolio itself. But the taxonomy focuses on economic activities, the actual environmental performance of economic activities. And this is a slightly different concept. And so some of the tools that we use to make decisions on economic transition, company transition, financial portfolios, for example, looking at emissions reductions in aggregate, are perfectly worthwhile tools and decisions to make. But once we look at economic activity performance specifically, we have obligations to think about the contribution that activity is making specifically to the goals, the economic life of the activity itself, the technologies that are available, and the performance that can be achieved. And that is why these are the areas that inform the criteria and why they seem tough. But this concept of transition is a little different in the taxonomy to how the idea is used more broadly. If we go to the next slide, please. So let's just recap on what activities are in the taxonomy. So point one, I think everyone knows this, activities that in and of themselves contribute substantially to one of the 6 environmental objectives. That essentially is what a business does in their core activity. Point two is where the transition idea comes in. And the term transitional activities in the taxonomy has a very specific meaning. So a transitional activity is one where there are no technologically and economically feasible low carbon alternatives. That's a very important statement. It's in the taxonomy regulation, but that can still support the transition to a climate neutral economy. And so wherever in the taxonomy there are criteria that are well above zero, they generally relate to this situation. So activities where there are no technologically and economically feasible low carbon alternatives. That's quite a high bar to jump. And it's very important that we note it. So that's how transitional activities are defined in the taxonomy regulation. And I think that is different from the idea of a portfolio or an economy transitioning over time, because there will be a mix of assets and a mix of performance, which we must eventually trade out of, reduce, improve the efficiency of, to reduce the emissions in aggregate. And we must understand the difference of these ideas to understand how the taxonomy addresses them and to help us focus on how to help companies, particularly, transition over time. I'll leave enabling activities for another day because we're focusing on transition. So if we could please go to the next slide. Now, the taxonomy presents us a great opportunity. A great opportunity. People who have been in business and industry for a long time will know that it can sometimes be challenging to get financiers and investors to understand the long-term vision of the company about where the company can go. But the taxonomy provides a tool to help us talk about the future, about where the capital should be going, and to get support from financial markets for the future. And the good news is that there is wide emissions and economic coverage already in the taxonomy. So the question on whether the green taxonomy encourages green finance or constrains it, we believe is clear. The taxonomy already includes activities in sectors that are responsible for over 90% of emissions in the EU. You can see them on this slide. And the taxonomy criteria cover roughly 47%, almost 50% of economic activities of listed companies in the EU, from land use to waste management. So there is broad emissions and economic coverage. Now we can increase those, and we believe we should. But the point is, this is the widest reach of any tool ever to support and encourage green finance and help companies and their financiers and investors talk about where we should allocate our capital in the future. And this is where we believe there's great opportunity on transition finance. So today, we will explore how the taxonomy already supports transition finance. And we think there are many ways that have not been fully understood. We'll explore what the taxonomy is not designed to do, when there are other ideas, other metrics, other thoughts about what transition looks like that we need to make decisions on. And we'll also explore how taxonomy could be developed in future to try and support as many companies and economies as possible to make the transition. And so today, if we go to the next slide, we have an excellent session. We have 6 speakers who will speak but roughly in turn, but there'll be time for Q&A at the end. And we do have a Twitter feed. I believe we've promoted that quite widely. In a moment, I'll just remember that hashtag and I'll tell you what it is if you want to post a question, and we'll do our best to ask the panelists at the end of the session. But if I can just introduce our guests very quickly. First, we will hear from Mukund Bhagwat. Mukund will discuss companies' experiences of preparing for transition and what companies need. Then we'll hear from Helena Vines. Helena is one of our rapporteurs on the platform, and Helena will talk about how taxonomy already supports transition finance and can support some of those needs that Mukund talks about. We'll then bring in Mark Lewis. Mark will discuss how financial analysis influences energy sector transition questions. We know we're talking about environmental performance with the taxonomy, but we just really must remember that there are financial questions that matter when it comes to allocation of capital. It almost doesn't need to be said, but we will consider what those financial transition questions look like and how they play into transition finance decisions. Then we'll hear from Jörg Ladwein. Jörg will discuss the experience of being an investor who has committed publicly to meeting a net zero by 2050 target, and how you think about portfolio transition and what types of decisions you would make and where taxonomy fits in those decision-making approaches. And then we'll finish with Nancy Sage. Nancy will discuss the early deliberations of the platform on the potential to develop criteria for significant harm and no significant impact activities, because we believe there is some opportunity there, and we want to share our early thinking with you on how we could proceed. So thank you again for joining us. No one has interrupted me, so I'm assuming that means that everything is going fine technically, which is excellent news. And if I can now invite Jacques Dupree, please, from the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission to start with his update, which will be on the realities of the 2030 and 2050 targets, the constraints of the 1.5-degree pathway. So, Jacques, over to you.
Thank you, Nathan. Good morning, everybody. I'm here to present you some modeling insights that will frame the discussion in terms of scientific knowledge on what the EU targets mean for the sectors. So energy climate scenario modeling is not really a description of what the future will look like, but it is scenario. So we are trying to present some potential results of scenario work with models Depending on many modeling assumptions, we get different results. So here the objective is to reach the climate targets. So we have some constraints to the model, but this doesn't say that we know the future. It depends a lot on the supply side, demand side assumptions, of course. And I want just to make a caveat that I'm not presenting here either a European Commission forecast or policy package. These are not the topic of my presentation. Instead, please click. I will show some scientific work related to emission trajectories. Here at the bottom of the slide, you can see from the IPCC special report on 1.5 degree, different possible pathways to reach 1.5 degree. From the left to the right, you will have stricter energy reduction energy demand reduction, and at the right you have more energy demand, but you also have more negative emissions. This is to show that we don't have one specific knowledge of what the negative emissions will look like in 2050, for example. It depends a lot on the technology development. And if there is no CCS or no biomass plus CCS technology available at the same scale as hoped, then we'll have to reduce energy demand stricter. So I will present one pathway, which is not exactly aligned on those 4 pictures, but it's just to highlight that it's only one possibility. Next, please. I will look at energy emissions first. So here is the EU climate targets. We need to reach minus 55% of net GHG emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2050, according to the law. So you can see on the left graph that the share of each sector is shown in a different color. The yellow one is the power sector, for example. We see how it decreases very quickly in the coming years. Please click. And also the other sectors are decreasing very fast. For example, the industry sector starts to decrease even faster after 2030, as well for the transport sector, and building sector are decreasing already very fast. So these are all trends that need to happen if we want to meet the objectives. We need to decrease emissions by every sector almost to zero by 2050. And this means already by 2030, some strong reductions. On the right-hand side, you see some potential landing points in 2050 with negative and positive emissions that add up to zero. There are two sets of bars because this represents 2 different scenarios that were used for impact assessment of the climate target plan of the European Commission. The red part, for example, is the carbon removal technologies. So depending on the assumptions on land use, emissions, and carbon removal technologies, you can have slightly different scenarios. The common finding, however, is that all the other sectors are really, really low. They need to go down basically almost to zero. Next. Next slide, please. Now, this is the energy demand by transport, buildings, and industry for the European Union. You can see in 2010, 2030, and 2050, the total. And it is clear that the energy demand is reducing strongly if we are to meet the objectives. You can click. If we look at the results by energy sources, Tina, please have a click. You see how the role of purple bars, which are for oil, is reducing very strongly. Also, the orange ones for gas, reducing almost to zero. And of course, at the very bottom, you have a bit of coal, which has to reduce as well because it's the main fossil fuels that are emitting what we need to decrease. The yellow bars is the electricity, so there is a strong electrification of all sectors, especially in buildings mainly, but transport also, to replace fossil fuels. This electricity, of course, has to be produced by renewable sources, but we'll come to that later. Please click. This was the results of one model, which is the POSE model from the Global Energy and Climate Outlook publication of the GRC. But if we look at the impact assessment of the European Commission work, you have another model being used, which is PRIMES, and it shows very similar results here with several scenarios each time. So I can use both results here because really they are relatively aligned, except maybe for some assumptions on technology development, which are showing here. For example, in purple, you have the hydrogen a bit higher in PRIMES results, but these are PRIMES results. Next slide. Now, if we have a deeper look at the power sector emissions, you can have a history of electric grid emission intensity in European Union thanks to European Environmental Agency data and projections up to 2030 showing what the needed decreases of emission intensity are if we are to reach the minus 55% emission by 2030. Then when we look at the grid emission intensity of can you please click, of the PRIMES model. Please click, Tina. You get very similar trajectory. And if we compare that to another model, which is the global model, which is GECO modeling, please have 2 clicks. You can see that it's very much aligned with the 1.5 degree scenario for the whole world. I would like to show also what would happen if we have a slight delay in the application of these decrease of emission intensity. For example, here the green curve shows what would happen if we are delayed a bit, like around 5 years, in the grid emission intensity. And then we already have a 0.5 degree of overall increase of temperatures in the world if the ambition of the world is delayed by 5 years, like is shown here for Europe. So this is a caveat that we should act really fast, and if we are delayed by some unexpected problems or issues, then we might miss the targets very easily. It is very strict science that says that the objectives are hard to attain, and if we are to reach them, we have to be very strict on the objectives and the deadlines. Now I will look at the power sector in more detail. Here you have the electricity production, and you can see at the bottom the gray is for coal. Right above you have gas, and you can see that gas kind of replaces coal and lignite as well. And at the top you see a strong development of yellow and blue, which is wind, solar and wind. But beware, this is a 2 degree scenario. Can you click, please? This is 2 degree. Click again. Now, if we want to look at 1.5 degree, it's not showing well, I'm sorry. We don't have the same results. We have gas which is basically stabilizing until 2030, 2035, then decreasing almost to 0. CCS is slightly higher, and you have a bigger role for biomass as well, which steps up and replaces gas basically. So the idea is that gas power is not making the switch from coal if we are to reach 1.5 degree scenarios, because it's already too much emissions and we need to go to bioenergy technologies. In terms of installed capacities, at the right you see a similar story where biomass is becoming a very important technology. And most of all, wind and solar technologies are exploding, really taking a very, very big role in the power system. Next, I will talk about what are the investment needs and what needs to change. So today, The share of low carbon supply side investments is around 1/3. There is 2/3 of investments which are not low carbon, for example, in the oil and gas exploration and production sector, which is a very capital intensive sector. But if we want to stay on the trajectory for 1.5 degree, we have to go up to 2/3 of low carbon supply side investments by 2030. So this is in 9 years. Instead of 1/3 or 40%, we need to go to 2/3 of low carbon investments. And if we go even further in time, it's almost all investments that are low carbon. So this is a very strong result from a scientific article. And it shows that the ambition is really high, and the change, the revolution that is supposed to happen in the investment sector is really a big disruption and a change of mindset, because all the economic activities that are in the carbon intensive activities need to decrease and disappear very, very quickly. So of course, there is some uncertainty shown by the arrows, but the picture is clear overall. And that's my final remark. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacques. Very helpful. We included this presentation to set out some of the parameters under which the platform is doing its work and the Commission. We hope that that has been helpful. But let's get into what the implications are for companies and investors. So we're now going on to Mukund, please. So Mukund, if you are able to unmute yourself and show your face, that would be wonderful. And may I ask you, how are companies thinking about this question of climate transition?
Yes, good morning to all. Thank you, Nathan. Thank you for the opportunity to convey the company's point of view. So how are the companies thinking about it? I think the fact that Europe has taken carbon neutrality as a target is on the mind of all the company at the highest levels, so that there is no doubt about it. Some companies are expressing their will in terms of saying we commit to be carbon neutral. Some others are doing, we have ambition to be carbon neutral. Others are saying we aim to be carbon neutral. And that is then translated in either, let's say, planning their own investments in the first place for low carbon or renewable energy, or having arrangements such as power purchase agreement with energy providers. It is important to note that not all the industry, manufacturing industry, are producing their energy themselves. So I think we have to somehow respect that the core business to which they are sticking to, for example, copper manufacturing or aluminum manufacturing, that they will continue to do this, and they rely on the energy generators to provide the green energy in abundant and let's say adequate quantities.
Mukund, thank you. So these are all good steps. Considering what we've just heard from Jacques, do you think companies are able to identify or determine what they should be doing to contribute enough to be a substantial enough improvement to align with these 2030 and 2050 goals?
Yes, I think so. I think so, because I have already seen examples of companies in the first place concentrating on improving their resource efficiency, which is essentially energy efficiency, also water efficiency, also materials efficiency, labor efficiency, etc. Avoiding waste, recycling, using more, for example, waste of somebody else, recycling it in order to make usable products. In general, becoming more circular. So even for example, using the CO2, which is emitted, capturing it back and converting it into fuels, for example. So there are ways to improve resource efficiency in the first place. Secondly, moving away from fossil-based energies and reagents. Fossil-based can be gas, can be fuel oil, etc. moving in the direction of, for example, hydrogen, or progressively moving towards gas containing more and more hydrogen as it becomes available, by investing into own equipments within their perimeters, within their sites, which are enabled to take up such, let's say, hydrogen-enabled gas, so that progressively, when there is enough green power available, that green power can be immediately consumed within the industries, so that the products are becoming less and less containing carbon. It's the same way also for the reagent switch. We are moving away from fossil-based reagents, for example, bio-based reagents like biocoal, biochar, or synthetic fuels, provided, of course, they are in adequate quantity. I think that explains some of the aspects.
Thanks, Mukund. So these are all very positive stories. I guess the thing that our audience is trying to distinguish is whether these types of investments we should consider a substantial contribution. And I guess this is the difficult point. So if a company is trying to communicate to, say, their banks or to their investors about how they're contributing to the 2030 goal, what should they communicate to convey that point? And I guess really what I'm asking is the taxonomy the right tool? Can it help them enough to communicate that story?
I think so. In the first place, it is common within certainly the multinationals and bigger companies to publish their sustainability performance through sustainability reports. So within sustainability reports, if there is also an expression of the target, the trajectory, as well as the target which they are trying to achieve, that could give an indication of how each individual company is contributing to the carbon neutrality or other objectives of expressed by the taxonomy, including their actual performance, because actual performance, both in terms of CO2 emissions, as well as energy consumption, as well as environmental performance, is to be published using the sustainability reports. To what extent it can be considered for substantial contribution, this is dependent on each and every sector. To what extent they are themselves in charge of making improvement in their own, let's say, performance of carbon in their product or environmental performance. I think this, in general, we have to go to a detailed technical discussion in order to be able to answer that.
All right, and so that detailed technical discussion, I guess sometimes it's not clear. I guess this is the point, isn't it, about how far a company should go and how far an investor should be looking in terms of improvement. All right, so we are going to explore that further. Please go ahead.
So what I would suggest, there are voluntary schemes such as, for example, Carbon Disclosure Project or let's say other similar schemes which go in details of what can be published. Now, this is at this moment quite burdensome. So if we can find out let's say, a more simpler tool to express the parameters requested by taxonomy let's say, in a public and open and transparent manner, I think we can find a way of both publishing it, getting the trust for the companies, and monitoring the progress of the companies. Okay,
thanks, Mukund. So that's a good explanation of the fact that there are emissions reduction metrics and progress for the whole company on emissions reductions are some of the things that are being reported to explain transitions, which is very helpful. Can I just ask you a question? I know the taxonomy is not law yet in terms of the obligations having commenced, but are you aware of companies that have been denied financing because they're not green enough?
Not to my knowledge, not yet, because the taxonomy is certainly, even the Climate Mitigation Act is not yet, delegated act is not yet final. But there have been indeed discussions and description about, for example, some activities within the metals production have been assessed and have technical screening criteria. Other activities do not have these criteria. So the question is then, is it automatically becoming non-taxonomy aligned? And we have been able to explain until now, no, there is a discussion coming on, there is a description coming on about how to apply this taxonomy. So at this moment, that has not been the reason to deny the finance. But it is possible that if the finance is denied, probably the company's efforts to contribute to carbon neutrality targets are either not communicated well, or are, even if communicated, not trusted. And there probably something like a verification by a third-party audit, etc., could provide a solution. But to what extent this can be done, this is feasible, I think each company has to determine depending on their need for sustainable finance.
Okay, Mukund, thank you very much. I appreciate your insights, and we'll come back to you in the Q&A. If I can bring in Helena, please. Helena works on our data and usability area. Helena, Mukund's laid out some of the concerns around our financing. Can you please give us an overview of how the taxonomy can support companies in transition finance at the moment?
Good morning, Nathan, and good morning, everyone. You're absolutely right. The taxonomy already supports transition finance, and it does so in several ways. And probably the best way to explain it is through an example. So let's look at this company, Eureka, which manufactures cars and some auto components. Today, only one of the plants, Plant A, for example, manufactures electric vehicles in line with the taxonomy criteria. Let's say that the plant generates roughly 20% of the company's revenues. Now, Eureka, it's a company that takes very seriously the transition and sees all the benefits of being a fast mover. It has already committed to net zero by 2050, the latest. So as part of its transition strategy, in 2020, it developed an investment plan. First, to expand the production of electric vehicles. Secondly, to increase energy efficiency of building D, because its EPC is terrible, and on top of it, it's in an area at risk of flooding. So it wants to make it resilient. And thirdly, it wants to invest in R&D to improve the performance of its electric batteries. Now, in order to finance all of it, it has allocated 80% of its capex for the next 4 consecutive years. 5 years passed, and in 2025, let's imagine everything goes well and Plant B is up and running, manufacturing electric vehicles. And on top of it, it has benefited from an increase of demand for electrical vehicles. And now, 50% of all the revenues are generated from Plant A and B, and they are taxonomy aligned. Now, while the expenses made to improve energy efficiency levels of building D and to make it resilient count, the revenues generated from that plant cannot. And this is because, and it cannot, until the vehicles the plant produces, meet the taxonomy criteria. I hope that the example shows how the taxonomy supports climate finance, and it does so by allowing companies to claim as green the capex and expenditures investing in transitioning. Company Eureka, for example, could have asked for several loans to finance the plan, and each one of them would have been marketed or could have been marketed as taxonomy aligned. Now, a few points worth highlighting from my side. The first one is that investments in R&D count, but also investments in enabling measures to renovate buildings, to improve the energy efficiency levels of buildings, even if they don't make the buildings green. That is, if after the renovation, the building still doesn't meet the taxonomy criteria. All those expenses count. And we are looking into for which other activities financing enabling measures could count, even if they don't render the activity taxonomy aligned. Secondly, the taxonomy allows companies to get rewarded for the efforts they are making through capex and the efforts made through revenues. And more important than where companies are today is how they progress. And the taxonomy allows for communicating progress through financial metrics. And this is equally true for financial undertaking. What is important is not so much where they are today, the stock, but how they evolve over time, the flow. And last but not least, debt lending products, and particularly those that allow us to ring fence the funds, like green bonds or green loans, are clearly going to play a major role in the transition. But so will bank loans in general. Let's remember that in Europe, bank loans represent roughly 80% of the economy's external funding. It's therefore absolutely essential that the investments companies make to transition through bank loans or other financial products to raise capital are recognized. And as long as they are part of an investment plan to render the activity or an asset aligned, they can. We believe, though, that the narrative should not stop there. Next slide, please. Investors and financiers will not look at revenue and capex alignment and your investment plans. Will not only look at that, but how those fit within the broader transition strategy, whether you're committed or not to net zero by 2050 or earlier, where your emissions absolute and relative are today, and what sort of short, medium, and long-term targets you have. And the same goes for the taxonomy, which percentage of your revenues are eligible, and what are your green revenues today, and what are your targets for the future, especially when it comes to capital investments. What are your capex alignment targets? Do you have an adaptation strategy? Is it in line with the recommendations of the taxonomy? But of course, we will be looking at other equally important areas like climate governance, lobbying coherence, progress reporting, and the just transition. We cannot forget the social angle. All of the areas you see in the slide are important for investors when assessing companies' transition pathways. So I hope that the example has shown clearly how the taxonomy supports the transition. Thank you for listening. Nathan, back to you.
Thank you, Helena. All right, so you can see, I hope, that there's been a lot of thought given to how companies can use the taxonomy to tell their story about the future and to undertake green expenditures and to raise finance to support that. Thank you, Helena, for the overview. These reflections respond to some of Mukun's concerns, I suppose, as of somebody speaking for companies today, but we understand there's more to do, and we're going to come to some of those points in a moment. Before we do, I'd like to invite Mark Lewis to come on. Mark, can you show yourself, please, and get ready to speak?
Yes.
Thanks,
Hi,
Mark.
Nathan.
Welcome.
Hi. Thank you.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
to see you.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mark, you're the head of climate investment research at BNP Paribas Asset Management, and energy market transition is one of your areas of expertise. And of course, we're talking about environmental performance here, but we can't forget that ultimately we're talking about financial investment or debt and the financial markets.
Yeah. And
how this market is going to transition based on the economic fundamentals.
Right.
And so may I ask you, in your view, what are we heading to as a likely energy mix, energy supply mix in 2030 in Europe?
Yeah, well, obviously, my crystal ball is limited in how detailed it can give the breakdown, but I think the broad trends now are absolutely clear. And in fact, what I've been saying over the last few months is that 2020 will come to be seen, with the benefit of hindsight, as the trailer for the full feature film of the energy transition that will be showing throughout cinemas across the world, not just in Europe, over the next 2 decades. And by that I mean that the change we saw in the energy market in 2020 is a foretaste of how the energy transition structurally is going to play out over the next 2 decades. Why do I say that? I say that because the most interesting feature of last year was that for the first time ever, wind and solar globally took more than 100% of the increase in global energy demand, and that will be true for Europe as well. We don't have the detailed statistics yet. Now, what that means is, from an investor point of view, we've crossed a psychological Rubicon, because I think there were many investors until now who've been skeptical, despite the very rapid growth of renewable energy over the last decade, have been skeptical that renewables would be able to step up and account for 100% of the increase in energy demand. The reason that's so significant, of course, is that the flip side to that is that once renewable energy takes 100% of the increase in energy demand, fossil fuels, by definition, have peaked. Now, I say it's a trailer for the full feature film because clearly there is the COVID impact on 2020 made it an exceptional year. But I think nonetheless, it will bring forward in time the speed with which the transition plays out now, because investors will be all the more wary of investing in fossil fuels. So I say that as an introductory general point. In terms of the specific question, Nathan, I think by 2030, the benefit for investors in Europe is that we have very clear targets. We know that the European Union wants renewable energy to account for at least 32%, possibly up to 34% of final energy consumption. And we also know that we have this ambitious energy efficiency target, which effectively means we need to bring down final energy consumption to well below 990 million tons of oil equivalent. So I think, on that basis, the current mix of final energy consumption in Europe, which is 36% oil, 15% coal, 20% natural gas, 10% roughly nuclear, and 20% renewables, is going to undergo a significant change. I would expect to see oil and coal fall, particularly coal, very substantially, renewables to increase substantially, overall energy consumption to fall in line with the energy efficiency target, and gas. It's an open question in my mind whether gas remains broadly stable in absolute terms out to 2030, or whether that too is lower than consumption today as a result of increasing use of energy storage technologies. That's the big open question, I would say. How quickly energy storage technologies advance now by 2030.
Thanks, Mark. So you've laid out the fundamentals in the energy market, which is very helpful. We're talking about a taxonomy and creating a benchmark for environmental performance. Do you think that the way we describe any of these technologies in terms of their environmental performance under the taxonomy will make a real difference to the fundamentals in this market?
Absolutely. I think if the taxonomy is finalized in line with what we were expecting, if for example, for new power generation, the limit of 100 grams per kilowatt hour is deemed to be compatible with net zero or with the Paris Agreement, I think that radically changes the way in which companies will think about future investments in power generation. I think in any case that is happening, but it's always helpful. I mean, I like to think about the whole way in which investors, and by that I mean both financial institutional investors and the companies that are making the industrial investments, think about the transition now is really as a feedback loop between policy and technology. And the key point is that feedback loop is accelerating all the time. Why? Because the cost of zero carbon technologies is falling all the time. And really to understand this, you can make a very simple point. The main distinction between renewable energy and fossil fuel energy sources is that renewable energies are inherently deflationary. And the reason for that is you don't have to go out and explore for the wind. You don't have to go out and drill for the sun. You build infrastructure where those resources are available. Once you've built the infrastructure, the energy itself arrives for free. So it's zero short-run marginal cost. And building the infrastructure gets cheaper over time because you get economies of scale and you get technology improvements. So that deflationary dynamic, I think, of renewable energy is increasingly well understood by the market. It needs to be reinforced wherever possible still by policy and regulatory incentives. And I think the taxonomy in this respect, that's one clear example, I think, where you would be more nervous about investing in new gas-fired power plants, for example, than you would have been in the absence of the taxonomy. But it's going with the grain of the underlying economics now. That's the really crucial point, and that's what will really make investors nervous about further investments in traditional fossil fuel, gas, coal, etc. Because once you've understood the deflationary dynamic of renewable energy, the next key conclusion, the killer app, so to speak, is that as renewable energy gains more and more market share, the entire energy system is subject to a deflationary dynamic. That's the real point here.
Okay, thanks, Mark. That's very important to hear about some of the factors that investors are going to be considering when looking at these energy investments. The broader picture is very helpful. Thank you. A question for Europe generally, I think, is if we're taking this portfolio approach to transition across the energy system, there might be parts of Europe's energy system which has higher emissions and part which has lower emissions. Is it still possible to do that and to meet the 2030 targets in your view and the 2050 targets? Is that a plausible pathway?
Well, I think, you know, the politics of this are beyond my frame of reference, but so there's a political question there about how member state governments agree amongst themselves who takes on the relative shares of the burden. But we've seen that was certainly the case for 2020, and I would expect a similar settlement for 2030. But if you extend beyond that to 2050, I think clearly we need to be at net zero across the entire European Union. So every member state will have to do that. The pathway to get there will vary because the starting points are very different. Obviously, some countries already have a very high degree of renewable energy and some have still a very significant proportion of fossil fuel energy in the mix. But one thing to look out for, Nathan, as well, which we haven't touched on yet, is really the emerging and key role of green hydrogen, I think, because in the Commission's vision of getting to net zero by 2050, green hydrogen accounts for up to 15% of final energy consumption across the EU by 2050. So we need to scale that up. And the good news is, because the feedstock for green hydrogen is renewable electricity from solar and wind, it's going to be subject again to this strong deflationary dynamic. So I'm optimistic that green hydrogen can become a significant part of the energy mix, certainly by 2050 in displacing gas and petroleum products, but by 2030 already as an industrial feedstock in industries such as steel and oil refining to displace the very carbon intensive and pollutive grey hydrogen that is currently used as an industrial feedstock. Okay,
Mark, thank you very much. Please stick with us so we can come back to you to explore these questions further. So now let's go on to Jörg Ladwein. Jörg, if you can turn your camera on, please. You're the Chief Investment Officer of Allianz SE. You manage a very large portfolio. And Allianz is committed to achieve a net zero 2050 portfolio. Can you tell us why you've committed to that target and how the progress is going, please?
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. I think on our net zero target 2050, there are three main reasons. The first one is actually, I think any company, and especially one of the size of Allianz, we have a strong responsibility towards society. Climate change is real, and we are a player as a financial company who cannot ignore that. But second, and most of all, I think more importantly, is that climate change endangers our core business model. So we insure physical risk at large scale. And if we cannot use our risk evaluation models in the insurance underwriting side any longer because historical time series that we normally use break, we cannot continue our business as is. The third reason that is actually close, obviously, to my heart as a Chief Investment Officer responsible for a large part of Allianz portfolio, is that we need to prepare our portfolios for the upcoming change. I think just as described by Mark before, this is real change, and I think obviously that needs to be reflected somewhat in our investment decisions in our investment portfolios. So it's basically preparing our portfolios as an imperative change.
Thanks, Jörg. And what are the main tools or metrics you use to set your goals and track your progress on this journey?
Yeah. I think just to wrap it up on the why and the what, I think we have committed to move our proprietary assets. That's about 800 billion to the net zero target. But we have to be also conscious of the fact that as of today, I think that we need to really rely on data and broadly accepted methodology that is available. And so we decided actually for the first 5 years, in line with the AOA framework, to focus on the listed investments in corporate bonds and as well as in public equity. And for that one, actually use like a full set of tools and metrics that we can apply. The main target for the first 5 years until the end of year 2024 is a reduction of our carbon footprint of 25% in public equities as well as in corporate bonds. For sectors, we set ourselves specific targets. So we focus on, especially for the energy sector in the first initial period. And what is also very important, we have engagement targets. And we also have targets for financing the transition overall. So like investments, increasing the share of investments in renewable energy, for example. And we track and report the progress towards our goals on a yearly basis. For the real estate sector, which we also have set ourselves like quantitative targets, we follow the GRAM model. GRAM stands for Climate Risk Real Estate Model. And that basically gives a benchmark for all the relevant segments in our real estate investments.
Jörg, thank you. So once again, we're hearing this idea come through of a sort of a portfolio approach to transition, which looks at emissions reductions in aggregate, and green exposure or green allocations is only one part of that, and it's growing. So using more metrics. How helpful do you think the taxonomy is going to be for that part of your decision making, which is increasing your green exposures? Have you already had a look? How are you preparing?
Yeah. I think the main advantage we see coming through the taxonomy is actually receiving more useful data from companies, businesses that they have to report in line with the overall taxonomy framework, including all the disclosure requirements that come. And so hopefully also beyond the mandatory reporting disclosures that are covered by NFRD, for example, we hope that businesses are encouraged to report on a voluntary basis useful data. I think what is also important to us, as we focus a lot on the climate change topic, the net zero target, I think the expansion of the taxonomy towards the other 4 environmental objectives will allow us to take a more holistic view of the environmental performance of our investments. I think that's actually also very important in our non-listed investments, where we cannot rely on data by commercial data providers or vendors.
So Jörg, thank you. Let's just try and be really clear for everyone on these ideas about what you're implementing. Would you invest in a company that does not have a high alignment with the taxonomy? And if so, what would you expect in terms of a transition story from them?
I think it's clear that that today I think you will not find many companies that will have, let's say, 100% of the activities taxonomy aligned. And so I think what we will look at basically, what's the starting point of a company in their mix of their businesses, and do they have a credible, substantiated plan to change the composition of their business over time. So let's say the energy transition that was described before is a good example. If you're an energy company and you move the mix of your energy sources away from the fossil fuels towards renewable energy, and you support that with very credible business plans, investment plans, I think then you stand a fair chance to be included in our investment portfolios.
Thanks, Jörg. That's very helpful, and I think a really clear message about how you think about allocating capital. As a closing comment, are there any lessons or messages that you would give the platform, the Commission broadly, as we're finalising these taxonomy climate delegated acts?
I think what the discussion showed, and also the feedback to the draft delegated act on the climate objectives, that there's a lot of need about explaining more and educating market players and society at large. I think there's been lots of misunderstandings about the taxonomy, and I think this event today is one of the possibilities to do more of that. So I think we should continue to do more of explanation, educating. I think usability concerns raised by the real economy actors in the financial sector should be taken seriously. But we should also not jeopardize the robustness and credibility of the science-based approach. I think that has to stay very clearly. I think anything that can be done to provide guidance on implementation and to develop user-friendly tools on reflecting also the proportionality aspect, I think will be really helpful in gaining wider acceptance of the taxonomy framework at large.
Thank you. Your very helpful comments. We appreciate that. Okay, so now let's go to Nancy Sage. So Nancy's also one of our rapporteurs and is looking after the group on potential extension of the taxonomy around no significant impact and significantly harmful activities. So Nancy, we've had a good discussion today so far on things that the taxonomy can do and the types of decisions that need to be made for which the taxonomy is not the main tool. But nonetheless, you are already thinking about how to extend the taxonomy, and some of the questions I think that came through would be things like what to do when my activities are unable to become low carbon, or what to do when emissions reductions are possible, but maybe not enough to match the best performers or the best available technologies, or what to do when the technologies we will rely upon in future are not widely available yet. These are all questions on people's minds, and I guess we're wondering how much taxonomy can be developed to support some of these points. So please give us an insight on what you're thinking about, and this is a good moment before Nancy speaks, just to promote the fact that we have a whole other session this afternoon, further exploring the ideas that Nancy's just about to talk about. And we also have a further session this afternoon talking about the types of ideas that Helena discussed on reporting and how to tell your story on capex and plans and meeting criteria in future. So please stick with us for those events if you can. But Nancy, over to you, please. Tell us what you're up to.
Okay, thank you very much, Nathan. Just want to check first that you can hear me well. Yes,
sounding great. Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, when Nathan says that I'm thinking about it, really it's the group that I'm the rapporteur of. We are one of the subgroups of the platform, and we were specifically tasked with looking at whether and how the taxonomy might be extended beyond green activities. And to understand what those are, I'm just showing you a little graphic that was similar to what Nathan showed at the beginning about the 3 different types of green activities in the taxonomy, particularly for climate change mitigation. Of course, you have these transitional activities, but there's another thing which is in the taxonomy regulation, which is that some types of activities should never have criteria set for them. And that is clearly laid out as being power generation from solid fossil fuel. So there is a little bit of what you might call significant harm type activities. The other thing that's very important to highlight when we talk about the work that the subgroup 3 is doing, looking at the potential expansion to taxonomies or to expanding this taxonomy to cover significantly harmful activities in relation to their environmental impact and also separately activities that have no significant impact on the environment, it's important to understand that there is already, and I'm sure most of you listening know this, within the taxonomy, this concept of do no significant harm, meaning that an activity to be counted as green has to not only be making a substantial contribution to one of the environmental objectives, but it mustn't be causing, it must be doing no significant harm to the other 5. And that's a very important point to bear in mind. If you could click on this slide, please. So here you see the 2 types of activities that our group has been asked to look at in terms of whether we recommend to extend the taxonomy to these, and if so, how and in what way such things should be defined. So touching on box 5 there, the significantly harmful activities, as I said, our group has been starting with the understanding that in the taxonomy already there are 2 types of mentions of activities which have significant harm. In fact, Article 17 in the taxonomy regulation sort of defines the way that significant harm to the different environmental objectives should be set. So we took that as a starting point to begin our work. We also took note of, as I said, box 4 there, which is about the fact that some activities are excluded from being given criteria to be green. So one of the things that we are also thinking about is, I mentioned that transitional activities are very closely linked to climate change mitigation, because that's at the moment the only place that transitional activities are defined. It's to do with low carbon. Whereas in our work looking at significantly harmful activities, we clearly have to look at all 6 of the environmental objectives. The other thing that our group has to look at is whether or not the taxonomy should be extended to look at activities that have no significant impact on the environment. Next slide, please. So one of the things we tried to do is come up with a graphic that helped us discuss these concepts. And this one we call falling curves. It's a very useful thing because it reminds us all that the taxonomy has to be dynamic, because as we heard earlier from the JRC, the targets are dynamic. We have to get down to net zero by 2050, but different sectors have to take slightly different paths. So this is a sort of generic falling curve of perhaps something you might think of as a high impact activity. It could be carbon dioxide, but it could perhaps be another objective. Perhaps we gave an example there of non-recycled resource input in terms of thinking about the circular economy objective. What is also important to say is that, of course, if you were talking about an activity that has low impact, it might have the same pattern of curves, but they'd be right down near the bottom of this picture, perhaps so low down that you can't really sort of distinguish them very clearly. And this is what we're thinking about. We're thinking about whether those kinds of activities should be pulled out and identified separately, and if so, how would that be done? I just want to point out some points on this graph because I think it really helps us with the discussion. You can see that we are trying very hard to avoid using the word brown or brown taxonomy, which I think many people or most people would understand is not a very good term to be using. However, we've ended up using traffic lights just because although you can use terminology such as significant harm and substantial contribution, when you try to draw a graphic, you need to have usually some colors if people are going to understand it. W in the red space there is an activity that is not meeting the do no significant harm criteria. It's clearly causing significant harm. X is an activity that is not failing the do no significant harm criteria, but is not yet at substantial contribution. And Y is an activity which is currently operating at a level which would be counted as a green activity. There's 2 things I want to highlight. One is point Z, which is the low carbon. Now, this graph is drawn as if there is no current viable low carbon option for this sector, this activity. But it's important to understand that as soon as that low carbon becomes available as a technology widely available, economically justified, then the substantial contribution curve, let's say that the low carbon technology becomes available within the next decade, then the criteria that might be set for 2030 might be that substantial contribution has to be the low carbon option, in which case that bottom line would drop down to the low carbon sort of band at the bottom. And it's important to understand that that would have some kind of effect on the do no significant harm curve that would also probably drop down in some way. And so the main point we want to get across here is that every area of the economy has to be improving. So we not only need to get activities and entities doing those activities and encourage them in their transition out of that significant harm space, but even if you look at X, you can see that if X stays at that performance level shortly after 2030 in this curve, they would find that activity drifting back into significant harm space. So really what we want to reiterate is that all the activities need to be continuing on a transition, improving their performance. So this is some of the things that we're looking at. Next slide, please. So how might these new criteria help with discussing transition and for companies to explain their transition plans? Well, what we've done is we've taken Helena's example of the company Eureka, I think it was, and we've tried to sort of say, well, look, here's a slightly expanded plan of how they're moving to do more green activities. And the point is that what is not green is just left as a sort of unknown in terms of reporting against the taxonomy. So you don't know what B, C, and D are. The company can explain it in its plans, of course, and its transition plans. What we're asking is, if you had an extended taxonomy, which had these other categorizations, would that help the company make their plans? Would it help them explain their plans? For example, you can see here that some of those empty boxes now are clearly labeled as significant harm activities. So it's clear that the company is doing something to move away from a significant harm activity. Maybe they're renovating that factory in C, or maybe they're closing it down and building a new one which is at the substantial contribution performance level. That's their plan, and they can use these things to explain them. And then what we also have is the remaining box being perhaps activities which have no significant impact. So what our group is looking at is how these definitions might help, and therefore whether we in the end recommend to the Commission that such an extended taxonomy would be useful, and if so, how they would go about defining these different types of activities beyond green. Thank you, Nathan. Back to you.
Thank you, Nancy, for the very helpful overview. And once again, this presentation is a reflection of our thinking to date, which we will develop, but we've tried to be as specific as possible on the discussions that are going on. Nancy, one of the questions that's come through a few times in the Twitter feed today, so the hashtag is #SustainableFinanceEU. The questions come through a few times around recognizing small improvements in performance. Do you think the types of ideas you're presenting here can help with this need?
I do absolutely think that, and I think it's important to say that one of the things that we have been thinking about is that, as Helena said, the capex to reach the green performance, the substantial contribution, that capex, those activities, those improvements are valid green investments. What we're asking as well is, are there any scenarios in which not reaching substantial contribution but making an improvement might be valid? I think we've reached the conclusion at the moment, and it's really important to say that the group is still thinking about this, that in most cases it is important to go on to substantial contribution. But there are perhaps some exceptions, and we're starting to think about those. I'll give you one really obvious one, for example, historical buildings. If you look at the building renovation of historical buildings that have perhaps cultural significance, as was mentioned by Helena, they're never going to get to be green buildings. And yet we need them to be as energy efficient as they possibly can be. As Mark said, we need to drive down the demand for the electricity, because we're going to need electricity for other activities. So even those improvements within, if you like, the yellow space, the middle space, where perhaps historical buildings are sitting, renovating them and counting that expenditure, even though those buildings will never reach substantial contribution, is a valid green investment. Similarly, the TEG recommended an approach in water supply sector, an improvement there. And I believe that that was put into the draft Delegated Act. So the way we're looking at it at the moment is there might be sectors where this is valid, but we'd have to look at it at a sector by sector case to really understand that there isn't a lock-in and that we're not somehow avoiding making the incremental improvements to get to substantial contribution, which is really what's needed for most sectors.
Thanks, Nancy. Can we just bring in Mukund then, please, on this point? Mukund, if you're there. Helena tried to give a good overview of how taxonomy can already be used, and you're aware of these discussions about how it could be, taxonomy could be extended. How close are we starting to get to providing the tools that companies need from a taxonomy perspective?
Thank you once again. I think the taxonomy's definition and explanation and the description as given by Nancy are extremely useful. It is important to stress that the companies want to improve by their nature because otherwise they cannot remain competitive. And the taxonomy gives them a guidance as to how that improvement will be measured in terms of how they are, for example, in line with the ambition of European Green Deal. So regarding this, for example, stranded assets, which Nancy mentioned, today already the equipment are foreseen to be upgradable in order to fulfill, for example, if you have the gas pipelines up to your factory, which are hydrogen enabled, in the sense that the hydrogen amount of hydrogen in the pipeline will go continuously up, then of course the companies have to foresee their internal usage of that equipment, so that also the internal turbines are, for example, hydrogen ready. And to the extent the hydrogen supply goes, for example, from today's 10% to 20% to 80% in 2030, these companies are able to retrofit, and that is what has to be foreseen in contracting phase when you are investing. And this can be verified by third-party verifiers. So the question of, for example, greenwashing or question of stranded assets could be settled by a transparency and verification methodology. Thank you.
Mukund, thank you. So I think one of the interesting questions then, if we're talking about building infrastructure which can support hydrogen in future, then there's a question over its performance level from an emissions perspective until that hydrogen is available. So I'm just interested, I'm thinking, who should we draw on here? Maybe Mark, you can come in, please. How fast is this hydrogen transition going? And what is your view about, if we go down this path of really investing in gas infrastructure, what are the risks here for investors and for financiers?
Yeah, well, a couple of points on that, Nathan. I mean, I think, first of all, in terms of the hydrogen transition, there is this open question of the interim stage between the current grey hydrogen. So just put things into perspective. Grey hydrogen today, hydrogen, which is used purely as a feedstock in industry today, is all grey hydrogen. By that we mean it's produced from fossil fuels, from natural gas under the steam methane reforming process, which means that for every kilogram of hydrogen you produce, you unfortunately produce 9 kilograms of CO2. So clearly unsustainable. Green hydrogen, by definition, will not emit any CO2 in its production process, because it will come from the electrolysis of water, breaking it down into its constituent parts of oxygen and hydrogen. The open question is, I think, how big a role will so-called blue hydrogen play in the transition from grey to green? Apologies for all the colours here, but I didn't come up with the nomenclature. Clearly that's where there is tension, because blue hydrogen, just to be clear so that everybody knows what we're talking about, blue hydrogen is effectively grey hydrogen with CCS attached. So you collect the emissions as they are produced, and therefore it's low carbon. It's not zero carbon, because with CCS there are always some emissions, and that's also an open question. How tight will the CCS technology be? Now, the Commission has given a very clear steer on this, and I think correctly, that blue hydrogen should really only be considered as an interim step. It definitely doesn't want too much capital being put into CCS for hydrogen, because the risk is you then get stranded assets. Of course, we talk a lot about stranded assets, I think in this context more than most, given that the Commission and the European member states will be putting a lot of public money in place here to incentivize green hydrogen. So there's this question of wasted capital. Stranded assets is really the pain that financial investors take, people who are holding the shares of the companies they're investing. Wasted capital is effectively the same concept, but it's the pain that society as a whole takes for the opportunity cost of putting money into investments that could have been better. That money could have been better spent in other areas. And I think blue hydrogen is in that category where, not only is the risk of stranded assets, it's, wasted capital for society as a whole. So I think my own view is that we will see much quicker cost reductions in the production of green hydrogen than most people expect today. And I say that simply because renewable energy is the feedstock for green hydrogen, and we've seen a much bigger reduction in the cost of renewable energies over the last decade than anybody thought possible 10 years ago. So I think we have to always bear in mind how quickly the technological revolution here is moving, and it's coming against the backdrop, with specific reference to hydrogen, of fossil fuel companies who've operated in a much more stable and actually an inflationary world. Fossil fuels, as distinct from renewable energy, are inherently inflationary because by definition you exhaust the easiest to deplete resources first. And when you've depleted those, you're forced to go looking for more expensive resources. Now, technology in fossil fuels can also help mitigate the cost, but there's always this fight between geology, the inherent inflationary dynamic of geology with fossil fuels, which is mitigated to some extent by technology. But nonetheless, overall, it's an inflationary source. So I think, you're already seeing incumbent players in the hydrogen space and oil companies who, obviously oil and gas companies who want to have as long a productive life for their gas reserves as possible, saying, oh, we need blue hydrogen, we can't move to green hydrogen too quickly. That's where the debate is on that. And I think technology will surprise us again, and then therefore it would be risky to bet too heavily on CCS for blue hydrogen, quite simply because CCS has gone nowhere in 15 years. I mean, it's gone nowhere. Cost of renewables has fallen by 80% in the case of solar in the last 10 years. CCS has remained flat or gone up. So in a way, that tells you a lot about how we should be thinking about this.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Very helpful. So, Jorg, I might just bring you back in because you, as an investor, have to think about both these financial transition questions and these environmental performance questions because you've set goals. So, what do you think about the labeling of the taxonomy, the labeling effect of the taxonomy and the criteria? Should we be setting criteria that encourage investment into sectors that might be green one day, or should we be setting criteria more based on what we know with confidence is green, providing that tool to the market? What's your view?
I think personally I would say rather the latter, and then obviously consider the other aspect, the first one that you mentioned, more on in the regular review of the criteria, right? So I think we need kind of predictability of where the criteria move to as well. So I think I would also favor, let's say, if some kind of outlook could be given together with setting the existing criteria. Let's say if it's a pathway, like in the climate mitigation case, it would be good that the criteria already, I think an outlook is given, maybe with some caveats, whatever disclaimers, but I think, that's my view on this.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So we come back to talking about pathways, about telling the story about how a company and investment will change over time, and then using the taxonomy as a performance benchmark or a performance criteria to help tell that story, to the market, so the market can understand how much the improvements in environmental performance will be, how long it will take, and so that the market can respond to that. And I don't wish to speak for you, Jorg, or Helena, who works for a diversified financial institution, but I think what you're saying is that if there is a credible story of emissions reductions and investment plans to meet criteria over time, this is something that investors are actually looking for. So therefore, not everything has to be green today in order for it to be attractive to investors. It's the change story around that really matters. So let's just bring in Helena on that point, because there's been some questions in the discussion around dynamic criteria. So Helena, you said that setting a plan to meet criteria so that you can count the capex as green is one of the core features of the recommendations around using taxonomy. But what about the fact that criteria might get tighter over time as we approach the goals? If we need to make them even more ambitious to meet those targets. What do we think about the implications of that for the market?
Yes, thank you, Nathan. And I'm not going to turn on the video because apparently my sound was not that good. So one of the things that we are working on in the data and usability working group is trying to see how we can improve predictability. Yes, predictability, and it works both ways. So on one hand, it is really important that companies give investors that vision of what their strategies are, their investment plans, but more, as I said before, how those investment plans actually fit within the wider strategy. Yeah, the more they are specific about that, the more they detail what are their capex alignment targets for the future, as well as what are their emission reductions targets, and how both sort of fit together, the better for investors. Now, on the other hand, we understand that also companies, in order to develop their investment plans, need to have more visibility of how those thresholds are going to be declining over time. And this is something that we are looking at. We're working with the technical working group to see how we can provide more clarity. Another thing I would say, the last thing I would say, is that, and now I'm speaking as BNP Paribas, we are advocating for having more clarity at EU level about the different sector pathways. Yeah, because the more we have that clarity on policy, the easier it will be. As Mark was saying, technology and policy, they go hand in hand, and they retrofit each, they feed back to each other.
Thanks, Helena. So we're coming to the end of our time here, and I think it's important that we don't try and deal with everything right now. We have more sessions coming through the day, which are going to unpack some of these issues much more. And so I think we should draw this session to a close now. I noticed that the questions coming through on Twitter are getting more precise and more specific, which is wonderful. I'll just try and address a couple of the points in my closing comments. Thank you to the panelists for your obvious expertise and experience. I think some of the questions that are coming through, I believe we're trying to address the issues. I think we're saying that in a transition, capital will not only go to those activities that are already green. I think we're trying to say that quite clearly to you. Investors will invest in companies that want to change over time and that have good plans to do so. And using the taxonomy to articulate how much they're going to change, how much they're going to improve on their environmental performance using the taxonomy criteria is the way that the taxonomy can and should be used. And that's why capex and OPEX plans are so important. So this is a very inclusive way for the taxonomy to be used. Now, none of this takes away the need for criteria that are environmental goal aligned. That is the whole purpose. So we know how good is good enough for these improvements, and that there can be a discussion, a dialogue in the markets about what improvements can be made today, what needs to be done in future. So many of the questions that are coming through, teasing out this tension between how do we know it's green, but aren't we narrowing the investment universe? The truth is we're trying to achieve both. We're trying to identify what's green, and we're trying to talk about how economies, portfolios, companies can transition over time with taxonomy as one tool. Now, thank you for the positive comments coming through on the charts that have been shown today. These will be discussed further in the next session. We also noted some questions around the modelling. Now, Jacques, if people are interested in the modelling, can I just get you to come on for a moment and just explain the best way that people can find further details on the modelling work you presented today?
Yes, of course. The best background that can be found is the EU Climate Target Plan Impact Assessment. There is a website where all the documents are listed for that. And another source is the Global Energy and Climate Outlook, which is a yearly publication by JRC. And I think these are the sources I mainly used.
Okay, thank you very much, much appreciated. So please study that modelling, and I think one of the most striking points here is that the difference between that 2 degree and 1.5 degree pathway, which is evident in that modelling. Now, just to confirm, the questions that we've been asking today, I have been taking them from Twitter. So that method is working reasonably well. So we encourage you to use Twitter later on today. And that will provide some feedback to the panelists so they can understand how to respond to you during those sessions. So 1 o'clock is the next webinar on developing potential taxonomies beyond green activities. So if you're interested in the types of things Nancy was talking about, please join that. And then at 3:30 CET, we have a webinar on data and corporate reporting that Helena and her colleagues will lead to discuss how to use taxonomy and how the reporting obligations are likely to develop in future. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoy the other sessions. Thank you to all the panelists and to the Commission colleagues. Wishing you a good day, and we'll see you later.